Okay, hey everybody. Thanks for coming today. Are there any homebrewers in the audience? Anybody brew your own beer? Okay. I used to do a lot of home brewing, and I don't really do so much of it anymore. It's hard for me to find the time to actually spend the 6 to 8 hours to build it up and tear it down. But one thing that I've always really enjoyed about it is the process. And you can kind of it's repetitive, but it's also kind of meditative in a way because you follow the same process every time, and you kind of refine it over time, and then the finished product will, there's a lot of variables that go into determining the finished product, whether it's good or not so good. And in a lot of ways, the way that we use Chef at Rackspace is similar in that approach, in that we are building application environments for Chef constantly every day. We have a team of engineers who come into work every day, and we build out application environments in Chef. And I think that most people who use Chef are working maybe with one organization and maybe a few different environments, but kind of similar technologies. Whereas what we're doing every day is when we take a customer onto our team, we're kind of what we call reverse blueprinting their application, and then piecing it together using core reusable cookbooks into wrapper cookbooks. And Ryan is going to get up in a few minutes and talk in detail about how what standards we've had to put in place in order to be able to kind of be repeatable in the way that we use Chef, and also kind of our CI testing and the way that we collaborate with customers on cookbooks, which I hopefully today that you guys can get something out of that. So. Rackspace, we used to do things in a very manual way. I mean, we used to be pretty much just a service company, and over the past several years, we've transformed into a product company that now released 18 products in 18 months and pushed code into production 2,500 times last year. And Chef is really something that's enabled us to do that, but we're still, a service company at our heart. And we've, basically, that's why we use Chef to build environments for customers and used it as a kind of service delivery methodology. Now, all the way going back from the manual roots to doing things in a very automated way now, most people are somewhere along that journey. I mean, there's a few people who are basically like the DevOps 1% in terms of methodologies and automation, but most people have a backlog. Most people have more projects that they want to get to, and my hope is that today you'll kind of recognize from some of the mistakes that we've made, be able to learn from some of the mistakes we've made on our journey, and some of the best practices that we've come and built up within our teams on this journey as well. So when I came to Rackspace, this is I would say it sort of felt like this, but maybe it wasn't quite as painful as somebody checking a spear over the wall. I was definitely the person that was focused on my terminal, not even aware of what was going on behind me. But going back to the homebrewing analogy, it was sort of more like someone sneaking into my house in the middle of the night and changing my thermostats around so that maybe a few months later when I tasted my beer, it tasted like bananas, which is a true thing that really does happen. So. It was a more subtle thing. For me, it was just solving puzzles and logging into systems and running the strace, GDB, whatever it was to try to narrow down the problem. But when it turned out it was something related to the application, for me, it was usually I would turn around and say, this is something on the application layer. You're kind of on your own at this point. So although it was, it was kind of you're solving the same problems over and over again, there was a certain amount of kind of job security and stability to it because you got very good at kind of tracing down problems and troubleshooting. But then around the time that developers started kind of provisioning their own servers on Slicehost, for example, you noticed that a lot of developers were getting involved in systems administration themselves. And then instead of someone kind of sneaking in and rearranging things in the middle of the night, it was more kind of like that scene from The Hobbit when all the dwarves are coming in and they're just out in the open, kind of destroying things and changing things all over the place. And that's more what it felt like. In fact, one of our customers, their developers were actually logging into the production servers and making config changes in production as recently as about a year ago, which is not a good thing to do. And since then, we've gotten them completely moved over to Chef and taught them how to use Knife and submit pull requests on Cookbooks and things like that. So it's a much, because of the DevOps methodologies and all the automation tools that we have now, I think all of us in this room would agree that we're in a better place today. In fact, I always think back to, if anybody's ever read ESR's Guide to be a Hacker, he wrote in that, in around 2000, he wrote, "No problem should ever have to be solved twice." And that is something that has really guided my, it's a statement that really holds true to me. And he also said that hackers should never be bored or have to drudge its stupid, repetitive work. And I think that we'll always agree that we would all agree with the automation tools that we have today, that we can automate a lot of that repetitive work that we used to do in the past. So really quickly, just to kind of dive back, for me, and just to give you an idea of how far we've come, I started off, actually my first job was a computer operator, and when I showed up to work, I used to work on a Spark station, and when I showed up to work on the first day, I was in this big glass fishbowl looking thing, and they gave me this piece of paper and they said, "Here are your procedures." And they've called them procedures. It was basically at 10 a.m., FTP this file over here, at 12 p.m., flush this print queue, and so on. So I was essentially, you could think of it as like a human cron, was my job. So, I was in that job. I learned C and I learned how to use VI, and then I got a job as a real sysadmin. But then I was more like, the woman in this picture is how I felt. I was at a small company, and I really just hacked away on problems until I could fix them. And I was under a lot of stress as well. If you've ever heard the saying, like, I think a million monkeys typing on a million keyboards could eventually produce the works of Shakespeare. It was sort of like that for me. I was all on my own, but I felt as if I hacked away at problems long enough that eventually things would work, but I wouldn't necessarily know how I'd fix them. So I moved to Rackspace, transferred to Rackspace in 2008, and because of the strong Linux community there, I really learned more in 12 months than I had probably in the previous 8 years combined. So I think that there's kind of a lesson for all of us in this, that today you can get involved in open source projects and attend meetups, and the one thing I love about the chef community is that everybody's so willing to share information, and you can surround yourself by people who are more skillful or have spent more time working with this than you have. So there's no better way to learn. But even at this time in 2008, the state of the automation tools weren't quite there yet, and I felt like I was reaching the top of my Linux game, but the lack of automation was really holding me back. And this is very much what it looked like when I came into Rackspace in 2008. We had literally over 100 sysadmins, and everybody's focused on their own terminal right in front of them, typing, and what it felt like to me, it was kind of like this dystopian future where everybody's focused on their own terminal, typing the same commands, solving the same problems over and over again, but you don't even necessarily know who's typing what next to you. Of course, we do things like we kind of have conversations at lunch and that type of thing, but you just know that everybody's like solving the same, fixing the same vulnerabilities, typing the same commands, the same one-liners over and over again. And I felt that way myself because I would log into probably 20 or more servers a day, and I never really knew what the environment was going to be. All I could really rely on was that the base packages would be there, but I didn't have any aliases on these systems because I didn't know because there were hundreds and thousands of servers that we were managing, and it started to feel frustrating to type the same one-liners and the same scripts over and over again and know that everybody else is as well. So some friends of mine and I put together our first take at automation tools. Now we had this system that we called Quick Snips, and what it was a Git repo that we shared with all the sysadmins on the floor, and everybody started contributing their one-liners and their scripts. And we used a few Linux tools called dmenu, xclip, and xdotool. And what those would do is it would read from this Git repo on your local drive and basically present a dynamic menu. You start typing in the name of your one-liner, it copies it, puts it into your clipboard, and then pastes it using xdotool into your terminal. And this enabled us to get around the lack of having aliases on every server. But the real power of this was the one-liners and the scripts, which grew to over 100 one-liners and scripts within about 6 months. So that was the first time when I started to feel like, as admins, we were actually collaborating on something the same way that our developer friends were. But there was still a lot to be desired with these types of automation. We had automation tools that relied on things like pexpect, and if you've ever used it before, if you're working with thousands of servers, you know people are changing prompts and SSH ports and things like that, and pexpect is not the most reliable method. So when it came time for me, there was a serious kernel vulnerability, and I was actually in charge of patching and rebooting 10,500 Linux servers, and we had about a 30% failure rate with our automation. So for the math geniuses, of which I'm not one, that's about 3,000 servers that we had to actually patch manually, and it took us weeks working around the clock to get that finished. And contrast that with today, when Ryan and team patched the Heartbleed vulnerabilities last week within an evening for all of our customers using Chef. So I've talked a lot about the frustration, and really what I think everything changed was the seismic shift was basically the cloud and our transition at Rackspace from a service company to a product company. And one great story about how we actually, that demonstrates how kind of a lot of the silos started breaking down at Rackspace was that we had some sysadmins that were working in support that basically were tired of installing WordPress and all the other kinds of software stacks that people were asking for over and over again. So they stopped their support jobs and they went and started working with Chef Solo and built a feature called deployments. And if you log into the My Rackspace portal, or the control panel today, you'll see a tab called deployments, and there's over I think 50 different deployments in there, everything from StatsD and Graphite to Ghost blogs and Minecraft and all kinds of different things, where basically you just click a button and it's using Chef Solo on the back end to provision infrastructure. And that was created by people in support that with sysadmins that were getting tired of doing the same things over and over again. On their team, they turned into a true product development team, and they integrated CI/CD methodologies on their team, and they had metrics with Graphite showing up, and they were coming back to us on support and saying, this is really exciting stuff that we're working with, and you guys should be automating too, and we wanted to play with the cool stuff as well. So there was really kind of a merger going on at Rackspace during that time, just between devs and ops and support. So at this time, basically, after learning about all these tools and using them very extensively on our product teams, Ryan worked on private cloud and used Chef for years constantly, and was really up to date on kind of the best practices with using Chef. So we talked to a lot of different companies, and apparently just about everybody that we talked to needed some help with automation and with using Chef. So we went to build a support team around that, and we were able to find rackers like Ryan who had a lot of experience using these kinds of tools. And essentially, I went from being a human cron to now I work on a team where everything is done through Git. And basically, one of our mottos on our team is if we're logging into servers and we're doing it wrong, because we can get so much runtime information from the metrics and the logs that we're collecting and aggregating, and we can control so much infrastructure through Chef versus the way that we were doing it before. So Ryan?
What's that? Okay. Thanks, Matt. I don't think I can claim to have ever been a human cron. Thankfully, I've never felt that way at Rackspace. But just to give you a little bit of my background, I started at Rackspace in 2007 on a Linux support team. I tend to claim I learned everything I know at Rackspace. Like you mentioned, we were essentially a factory for producing sysadmins, system engineers traditionally, and now moving forward, really this idea of automation engineers, right? There's a ton of rackers starting to learn these tools. My first Chef exposure was with what he said with our private cloud team. So Rackspace uses Chef to build and deploy OpenStack private clouds for customers. And we've seen the good, we've seen the bad. But really what it came down to is being able to deploy really, really complex infrastructure. If anyone in here has ever deployed OpenStack, you'll understand how complex it is. But trying to deploy OpenStack with Chef, we realized we can do this, and we can probably do this for customers, right? And so we set out to figure out a way to take our idea of managed services or a managed offering and actually bring that to customers, right? So take all of our knowledge about running web infrastructure and pull that into automation, and actually help customers achieve automation without getting in their way. And so one of the big questions is, and we chose Chef to do that. And the question I always get is like, why did you guys choose Chef? There's these, why not Puppet, or why not Ansible or SaltStack nowadays? We hear a lot about those. Back then, both Ansible and Salt were extremely young when we really started this effort, and so maturity is actually a really important thing for us. Chef wasn't the youngest kid on the block, and that was a good thing. It had been around for a few years. We had experience with it. There's a ton of expertise inside of Rackspace for Chef alone. So we have training internally. We have a ton of product teams, like you mentioned, that are actually using Chef to deploy and run their own product infrastructure. The ecosystem is insane in Chef, right? Test Kitchen, Bergshelf, all these tools that were written just by people who use Chef have now been adopted by Chef, the company, right? And have become like major workflow tools. And one of the actual features like we really needed was multi-tenancy. Rackspace, said that we don't want to run 100 Chef servers, right? We want to run 1 or 2 or 1 in every data center, or whatever it might be, but we need to be able to put lots of customers on it. And Chef essentially gave us that out of the box. One of the things I like to talk about is our Chef model. And when you're looking at this, if you have any experience with Chef, this is going to look very standard. We use environments, production, staging, development, whatever it might be. We use something similar to roles, which I'll talk about in a second. But when you think about roles, you take like in a web infrastructure, there's usually a logical separation. There's a web node, an app node, there's a caching node, there's a database node, nowadays there's a MySQL node and a Mongo node and a Redis node, all kinds of data stores. And there's some sort of base role that applies something that you need on all of your machines, right? And for us specifically, we also have a Rackspace base role. We said there's a few things that like Rackspace has decided that you must have everywhere, right? And like Chef Client is one of those things, and NTP, and how the Rack user gets put on the machines. And then there's this idea of reusable or core, we call them core cookbooks, but these are all the things that do the heavy lifting, right? So cookbooks for Nginx or PHP, Python, whatever it might be, any system that you need to use, there's a core cookbook for it. And these are completely generic, open source core cookbooks that anybody can use. And so the big difference here is this item on the left in the middle, which is, we call them Rulebooks. I don't know if anyone is familiar in here with the idea of an application cookbook that's been popularized by Bergshelf. It's essentially, the idea is a cookbook that contains everything needed to deploy and run your application. It uses Bergshelf to essentially form the wrapper cookbook model, handle dependencies. We took that same idea, but we applied it to roles. So a quick definition of a rulebook for us is it's a wrapper cookbook with a role focus. It allows us, the primary reason for it was version control, but I'll show you guys everything else we get from it. One of the big things we needed was a way to abstract something that made sense to web infrastructure, and then also be able to store it in version control. And so roles actually make a lot of sense. There's always, at Chef, there's kind of like some people who love roles, some people who hate roles. We're somewhere in the middle. We believe in roles, but we need the ability to version control them. And so what we did was take the idea of wrapper cookbooks and applied roles to it. And so at its most basic form is a rulebook is a cookbook. It looks like a cookbook. It has attributes and recipes. It has files and templates, and it can be tested just like a cookbook can be. But it lets us do a lot more. So we can set overrides in it. So let's say in my rulebook, my web rulebook, I have Nginx. If I want to set an override in Nginx, I can define that in my rulebook, if you will, in a recipe in my rulebook as node.default, Nginx, template location, what have you. We includes recipes. So normally when you're building a role, you have this idea of a run list. Well, in a real production system, those run lists can get incredibly long. And so for us, that's an array in Ruby that we just loop through and say, these are all things that are part of your run list. And that becomes, something that's stored in Git, right? And anytime someone changes it, we'll know because there's a Git history there for it. We can add monitoring in these rulebooks. This has actually been a really big thing for us. It's been both a challenge and an interesting problem to solve, which is every time I boot a web node, there's some sort of monitoring that I care about for web nodes, right? And that monitoring is probably different than what you care about for your database nodes. And so monitoring should be implemented in this abstraction for a web node. I should be able to say, anytime I boot a web node, I should always get the same monitoring on that web node, right? Whatever it is I care about, maybe it's RAM usage, maybe it's CPU usage, but every web node should always get that. Maybe it might provide application logic. So app nodes, web nodes, this idea of an application cookbook where I may go fetch an application artifact. I may untar it, deploy it, restart some services. I can do all of that inside of these cookbooks if I need to, or rulebooks, excuse me. This is where we'll leverage APIs. So if you look at some of the community cookbooks right now, you'll see that some of them have recipes to interact with like AWS, for instance. A lot of this is very common for like EBS volumes, like if you want to attach block storage. We don't actually put that in any of our core cookbooks because that's an idea that really is bigger than MySQL shouldn't have anything to do with the disks under it. I should tell MySQL what to use as its data directory, but the MySQL cookbook shouldn't be interacting with APIs. There's no real reason for that. But inside of this wrapper cookbook model, it makes total sense, right? So I've got a web node, and anytime I spin up that web node, I want it to be part of a load balancer, right? I want it to make an API call to the Rackspace cloud, and I want to add myself to a load balancer. So we maintain a cookbook, much like the Amazon one, but one for Rackspace, except we don't include it in our core cookbooks. We do it inside of these rulebook level, right? ACLs, we'll define ACLs here. So all my web nodes need port 80 and port 443, but nothing else. Everything else will be denied. We define that at this level as well. Again, because that is a concept reserved for the role, not for Apache or Nginx itself. Apache and Nginx know nothing about, well, I guess technically they know what port they're running on, but they don't really know anything about your business logic and what ports you need to allow in. And then, well, like I said, the biggest thing here is that it allowed for version control. So our workflow is basically dev rulebooks, commit to Git, upload to Chef, run Chef client or provision new nodes. So any changes by any tech, Racker or customer, can always be inside of version control for auditing, for blaming, whatever you might want to do, right? Blame Racker for like this change, one of the other alternatives that we're not currently using is this idea of environment cookbooks. This is something that Jamie, the guy who made Burkshelf, has started pushing. It's actually something our team talked about almost a year ago. Was this idea of having a cookbook that contained all of your environment data. We haven't been using it, but it would certainly be an option or an alternative to rulebooks. So you could theoretically have a environment cookbook where every recipe was a role, right? So I would have a web role recipe. I would have a MySQL role recipe, and these environment cookbooks would contain everything needed to deploy your application environment. All right, so I wanted to talk about some of the challenges, like very specifically challenges that we've had on our team with some of the, with Chef or some of the cookbooks, and like what our solutions have been. And just to give people an idea, in case you may or may not run into similar problems. So Cookbook Standards has been one of the biggest problems that we ran into. We started out leveraging community cookbooks, and we ran into a problem after a few customers where like all the community cookbooks they're sort of all over the place, right? Some are written by really experienced chef people. Some aren't. Some depend on other like dependencies, right? So like one example I like to use is we had two cookbooks that both depended on Java, but they both depended on different Java cookbooks, which used the same namespace. So like I couldn't have both of those in a production environment because their underlying dependencies were different. And one of the big things I like to mention is open source is more than just like code sitting on GitHub, right? It's having someone define a direction for whatever that project is, someone to govern it, someone to be responsible for it, and defining those standards. And so we had to do that for Cookbooks with it for ourselves. And so I want to go over some of our best practices that we've defined for Cookbooks, and hopefully they'll help you guys, with yours in the future. All of our cookbooks, by the way, are open source, Apache 2 licensed. I'll give you, the link will be up here in a little bit if anybody wants to look at them. Some side benefits, actually, we did fork community cookbooks, and some we wrote ourselves, but we did fork. But one of the benefits of rewriting this was helping our team become very intimate with Chef. If you're just consuming Chef, sometimes it becomes very hard to understand the patterns and become very intimate with it. Once you start writing cookbooks or rewriting other people's work, you'll become very intimate very fast with it. All right, so testing pipelines. There's a lot of talks regarding testing pipelines here for Chef, so I'll go through this pretty fast. But this is what ours looks like. And the reason why we had to develop this testing pipeline was because we found that there wasn't any standardization of tests, there wasn't any enforcement of tests, and there was no guarantee that testing was being run on community cookbooks. And when you're a service provider providing something for customers, that doesn't fly, right? You have to say that this cookbook will do what it claims to do, and it will, we're not going to break it a year from now or a month from now, right? And so as a company providing a service to customers, we had to make sure that our cookbooks test. And anyone who's used Jenkins knows that red and stormy is like the worst thing ever. Our Jenkins dashboard was full of that until we started enforcing our own testing pipeline. All right, so we use Jenkins as our CI server. It's connected to GitHub. It listens for pull requests on the core cookbooks, so like Apache or Nginx, whatever it might be. And then it will fire off a job for each, there's a job for each cookbook. It will fire off a rake command. Rake basically can be used as like a Ruby workflow. The first thing it's going to do is run Rubocop. Rubocop's a Ruby syntax checker. One of the really interesting things about Rubocop and all the community cookbooks is almost none of them support the Ruby 1.9 syntax, which is the version that Chef runs on. 1.9.3, almost all cookbooks use like a 1.8 syntax. So that's a lot of work to go and unravel all of that. It doesn't break Chef, but it's one of those things that you should probably have the proper syntax. We use Food Critic, obviously for Chef best practices. We don't yet write our own Food Critic lints, but I would expect us to in the future. We do use Chef Spec as well for unit testing and testing logic of cookbooks. Make sure we don't break our own logic in the future. And then Test Kitchen plus Server Spec for functional tests. One note here is a lot of community cookbooks had mini tests, some had bats. These are all testing frameworks. We haven't ripped all of that out, but we will make sure that even those tests pass before we say like this cookbook is good to go. Any new ones that we're writing are pretty much being all done in server spec. And then for post steps, we use Thor, which is a Ruby CLI. The main post step that we do is if a test goes through, if a Jenkins run goes through correctly, it will tag the Git repository with the same version of Chef. So whatever the version of the cookbook is, it will tag that, push it back up to GitHub. So we always have a tag for every single version of every cookbook that we release. And then the final step is always a human. Right now, it's always a human to do actual code merger. And so what that means for us is that like our Jenkins dashboard is much happier. As you can see, like most of the items are blue. The Postgres one, that's still a work in progress. The guy who's working on it sitting up here, so he's the reason why my dashboard has a red thing in it now. A lot of them are still stormy because honestly, like once we get a cookbook in a state and it passes its test, we honestly don't have to add much features to it. So I'd like for all these to be sunny, but we're not always adding that many features. So let's talk about some other best practices that we're doing. So dependency versioning. This is another problem we found with a lot of community cookbooks is dependencies often will say like, my cookbook depends on Nginx, but it won't tell me what version. And so at some point in the future, if someone commits a change to Nginx, pushes it out to the site, community cookbook site, I do a Burks update, I get a whole new version of Nginx that gets deployed to my Chef server, out to my web servers, and then boom, something breaks, right? This happened with MySQL. We've actually ran into this problem with MySQL a number of times. That cookbook changes scope so often. And so all of our cookbooks now, for any dependency, locks down to major minor version. Highly, highly recommend doing this if you're really running Chef in production, well, at least with Chef Client. If you're running Chef solo, it might be a little bit safer because everything's self-contained in the run. Let's see. Another item that we've really started pushing through is this idea of configuration hashes. This was sort of talked about by Facebook last year at ChefConf. But for config hashes, or basically at the end of the attribute hash, you define what the directive will be that's going to be laid down in the configuration file, and then what the value is, right? We also prepend it with this config hash, so I know that for any cookbook I ever go to, I can look for this hash, and I know that that's where the configuration items are going to be. So what does that mean? So like for memcache, this is very specifically what happens is there's Rackspace memcache config, and then the directive is the key, right? So like -m, -p, whatever it might be, and then the value is the other side of that directive, right? So in my template, all I have to do is write a loop to loop through that hash and write out everything it finds, right? And that gives me every attribute I could possibly ever need for memcache for someone to define without actually having to define an attribute for it. So hopefully that makes sense. It's something that we've been adding to a number of cookbooks. It works for some. A really good example is syscontrol. This is what Facebook did it for. Syscontrol is thousands of possible items that you could tune. You probably don't want to write an attribute for all of them, right? So this is a way that you can get access to all of them without having to define a unique attribute for each one of them. It's also a little more dangerous in that anybody can populate this hash with absolutely anything, and if it's something bogus, it's going to fail, right? It doesn't work for everything, so we also have been adding in template overrides for all of our cookbooks. This is another thing that makes our life a little bit easier. We define a hash called templates, and then the name of the actual template file that we're going to be overriding, and then we name the cookbook that template exists in. And so what that looks like in your actual template resource declaration is there's an item called cookbook, and then the name of the cookbook that template lives in. And by default, this is, if you don't define this, it'll say the template's in like my own cookbook, the cookbook I'm currently in. But by declaring this chef attribute, I can now override the template location. So for Nginx, where it's really hard to write out Nginx configs with attributes, templates actually work really, really well. In my web node, I'll put my template in my web rulebook, right? And I'll just override that location with the rulebook name. And so my template will get pulled from my rulebook and not from the core cookbook. And hopefully that's not too confusing. The main point there is that like an Nginx cookbook, an Apache cookbook, whatever those are, should be completely generic and reusable and should not contain any business logic whatsoever in them. The second you want to add your business logic, even if it's something as simple as a vhost, right? You need to be able to abstract that out of those core cookbooks, and you need to put it somewhere else. And this is one way that we do it. Another item we do is we don't do source installs. For any number of reasons, we just don't do them. So we removed any cookbooks that had source installs, we removed it. We're actively going through and removing what we call technical debt. So a lot of cookbooks support like Windows. We currently don't support Windows, and so it's code that we don't need we don't need like breaking our logic. AWS, we're not going to support AWS or Rackspace. We're going to remove those features. And like I said earlier, I actually personally don't believe that you should have anything interacting with an API inside of a core cookbook. That should be in some other higher abstraction, right? Unsupported OSs, there's a lot of support for OSs that, my team supports RHEL, Cent, Ubuntu, and Debian. We make sure that our stuff works on those OSs. So there's no extra logic needed for operating systems that our team doesn't support. And then our naming scheme, you may have noticed everything I've been showing is Rackspace _. We have a common naming scheme for all of our cookbooks, which will be like Rackspace _. And part of the reason why we did that is so that we didn't stomp on like the Nginx naming scheme. If we just called our cookbook Nginx, and for some reason a customer wanted to use the actual Nginx cookbook, we'd have like attribute clashes then, right? So we are rename spacing all of our cookbooks that we're rewriting. It's an example of IP tables one. Same thing, Rackspace IP tables, config. What we're doing there is we're giving an empty hash for the chains, and then again we can loop through those chains or loop through those hashes to write out a chain to an IP tables file. We're enforcing Berkshelf everywhere. So this is just one of those things that if you guys aren't using Berkshelf, I highly recommend looking into it. But enforcing Berkshelf in all of our community cookbooks to make sure everything resolves when we're doing dependency, when we're dealing with dependencies. And one of the items that we're really talking about a lot right now is this idea of adding monitoring or data collection to the core cookbooks. So with Apache, with Memcache, with MySQL, there's usually like general plugins that a lot of people will use, whether it's New Relic or a Nagios plugin or Cacti or whatever it might be. There's plugins out there that like can give you the data you need. And every time you deploy one of these nodes, you probably want that data. So why not just put that in the core cookbook, right? So we're starting to look at doing this as well. Rackspace has a product called Cloud Monitoring. It's what we use for our data collection and alarms. And so we're starting to add these plugins into our core cookbooks as well. Again, so every time that we boot a Memcache node, regardless of what customer it is, we're always gathering the data we need. And this is the locations. These are actually, I need to fix these. My apologies. It's Rackspace-Cookbooks with an S. That's where all of our cookbooks are. And our contributing guide is in there as well. So it's got some of our standard files and a lot of this information that I've been talking about today. So some other challenges we've ran into that we haven't necessarily solved yet. I'd just like to tell you guys about them. And where we're going is one is around Git Workflows. We originally, like I said, we store everything in Git around Rulebooks and started out as very simple feature branches or merge to master, push up to staging or production. This worked fine for a few customers and for a few techs. But one of the problems we ran into was we started getting into a situation where this would break down when we had to change to the staging environment, but then we needed to push a change to production for some critical reason, right? And all of a sudden, I couldn't do that without pushing the change to production. It's the way Chef version constraints don't let me, I can't ever have more than one difference between like staging and production, right? I can only say, this is what staging version is, this is what production version is. I can't have anything else. And so, what if there was a well-defined Git workflow for use of cookbooks, Chef, and dealing with multiple environments? So that's something that our team is working on right now, is trying to figure out what that is. It probably looks something like a Git branch for every Chef environment, and then doing merges that way. But we're still trying to define it. I'd really like us to publish it once we're happy with it. There's already some tools that exist to do some of the versioning and fixing it, like knife spork is something that we want to look into. And there's the new Berkshelf workflow stuff that looks really interesting as well. So that's a problem that we have currently that I'd be really interested to hear if anyone else is using Git for all of their cookbooks and what that workflow looks like. Certainly talk about it. monitoring has been a really interesting challenge for us, and that's mainly because alarms are unique. So monitoring for every application, every customer, every infrastructure is going to be different. You as a customer might care about alarm threshold of X, and you as a customer care about alarm threshold of Y. And it's really hard to bake in and make it really reusable. But one thing we can say is that data collection, data metrics, that's very generic, right? Most people want that data. You know, I may not alarm on CPU usage, but at some point in the future, I probably care, you know, or I want to go see what it was. And so that's where we were talking about putting data collection in the core cookbooks and making sure it's always there, and then making alarms, you know, those kind of by definition are custom. Yeah, so what if we had standard data collection in all of our cookbooks? Meaning anytime you booted Rackspace Memcache cookbook, it also hooked into Rackspace Cloud Monitoring, and you always had the Memcache stats in your cloud monitoring, right? So that's what we want to get to. Another challenge that we've had is, you know, Knife is great, but we need a bigger picture tool. And I really wish that I had known about Chef Metal before the keynote this morning. You know, I wish we could have been playing with that. But Knife lets me provision a node, right? It lets me mess with Chef for one thing. But it doesn't let me define the way I want my whole entire environment to look, right? And so that's where items like orchestration come in. So Rackspace recently released the Rackspace orchestration, which is based on the OpenStack Heat project. And it, you know, it lets us define entire environments. If you're used to AWS, it's very much like CloudFormation. It lets us define entire environments. It has Chef resources in it. So it has like full Chef Solo support. So it has like Burke Shelf resources, and you can actually do some really interesting things with the orchestration engine in Chef Solo. You can inject Cloud init via user data. So I could say, you know, inject this user data, spin me up 10 servers, inject this user data, and make them become web nodes, right? Autoscale is another thing that our team is really interested in. You know, it's also a very recent release from Rackspace, is the Autoscale product. So we're starting to play around with it, and that looks like, you know, Cloud init via user data as well. So, you know, we can inject Cloud init. We can inject a cloud config that tells Cloud init to make this node a web node, right? Instead of just a generic server. But after this morning, you know, Chef Metal looks very promising. I don't know if everyone saw the keynote this morning, but being able to define additional nodes as resources in a Chef run is very, very interesting for us. One of the things that I'm already thinking about is that's very Chef specific though, versus like orchestration, which is very provider specific. You know, which one's going to be the right one to go with? I don't know the answer yet. So that's pretty much it. The last thing for me to say is that, you know, we're hiring at rackertalent.com. If anyone's interested, or you come chat with us at the Rackspace booth or in here. We're hiring both, you know, Rackspace is always hiring for Linux admin, Linux engineers, but our team is absolutely looking for, you know, automation engineers, DevOps engineers, people with Chef experience, automation experience. And then Matt and myself, those are our Twitter handles. If you want to, you know, connect with us on Twitter. That's pretty much it. And so I will take questions while we have time. How much time do we have left? Oh, we're over time? Oh, okay. Well, we'll be around, so if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.